hello everyone who's joined us. Very excited for you to join us. Geraldine, where are you based again?
We're in Vancouver, Canada.
Vancouver, lovely. And what time is it there this morning?
And it's 10 o'clock in the morning. And for the first time in many, many days, the sun came up. We've had
Oh,
rain, 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 rain.
yeah, it's pretty dreary here at the moment. Jessica says she feels like she's cheating on a test.
And you're in
Yeah.
London?
I'm in London. So and it's dreary and it's January and it's a pandemic and
Yep. Yep.
what a time to be alive, Geraldine.
I know.
While we're waiting for more people to join us, maybe you want to tell us a bit about you and how you got
Sure.
into this area of medicine.
Sure. My expertise, I guess, and my curiosity, both of which are important, came because I had, I don't think I ovulated until I was 25. And my period started when I was 13. Actually, on my 13th birthday, I got
Wow.
my first period. How's that? But when I went away to university, my period totally went away. And I knew I wasn't pregnant. I knew enough at that point to know that. And I didn't tell anyone. I assumed it was okay. I was a normal weight. I was stressed. I was working really hard. But, it was just such a totally different environment than the village where I'd grown up. I mean,
Mhm.
the university I was in was bigger than the biggest town that I'd ever lived in. It was a huge change. And I was in a dormitory. I mean, somebody who would go off wandering into the wilderness as a teenager or to be locked in a dormitory, and we were literally locked into it. The doors closed at 10 o'clock and were locked, and you couldn't go out without a alarm ringing if you went out before 6 a.m.
Mhm.
And it felt awful. That was to protect the women. I remember I was going to university in the 60s. So
Mhm. And how long have you been studying like women's health?
I guess systematically since I came to British Columbia in 1976. I moved from Alaska to Canada in 1976.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we've got loads of people joining us, 30 participants. Hello, everyone. We might get started on time. Why not? Hello to everyone joining us. So I'm Alice. I'm one of the founders of The Lowdown, which, as you may know, is a big platform for contraception reviews and information. I set up the site after having loads of problems with my trying to find a method of contraception that suited me. And to date, we've collected thousands of reviews from loads of people on every method and brand available. And yeah, so I'm really interested in learning more about women's health and helping women and men make better informed health decisions when it comes to reproductive health. And have been on a bit of a journey for the last few years, learning loads about periods and fertility, contraception, and yeah, periods is just something that comes up all the time. So I looked for a absolute expert in this topic, and I'm very pleased that Geraldine can join us. I'll let her introduce herself a bit more formally, but she's basically, written the book, done the research, knows everything there is to know about your cycle, your hormones, and she's going to take us through some slides which cover, well, she'll tell you what she's going to cover, but the basics, but also, some science, I guess, that we might not all see or hear about in the kind of the media or, what you may have learned at school. So Geraldine, with no further ado, please take it away. If you've got questions, pop them in the chat. I'll be interrupting Geraldine frequently to make sure I understand what she's saying. But yeah, please pop them in the chat, and excited to have everyone here. Go for it, Geraldine.
Thank you very much, Alice. It's a privilege to be here. the purpose of the center that I founded, the Center for Menstrual Cycle and Ovulation Research, and the website login is there on this slide, is to make scientific women's experience. And so, although I'm a scientist, women are front and center in everything I do. So what we're going to talk about today is the important and exciting idea that it takes two hormones, progesterone and estrogen, to create a healthy menstrual cycle and to create healthy women, both when we're menstruating and for the rest of our lives. So first of all, I'm a university professor. I have a full-time salary, and I don't have any commercial for-profit interests. I have some grants, and the picture on the bottom right is lovely, I think. I kind of like progesterone, so my bias is right up front. So we're going to talk about why we have periods, what's normal for menstrual cycles, what's normal about ovulation. We're going to talk about, and I've put it in a different order for just to be sure that we can cover it, PMS and heavy flooding, light flow, irregular periods. We won't cover everything today, but I'll give you the fundamentals so you can start to figure it out for yourself. So first, quiz question. I'll be asking quiz questions throughout, and then you'll have a chance to see the answers later. So mammals, animals that nurse their offspring, have periods. Some of them do and some of them don't. So which mammals shown here have periods?
I'm going to guess a monkey or a chimpanzee.
Aha, that's a good one. And obviously the woman in the center.
I think a rabbit does, because when I was a kid and had pets, I'm sure that there was something going on there. Or maybe that was just my rabbit. No?
That'd be surprising. There's
Oh,
one peculiar kind of rodent that has periods, but we can come back to that. Let's go on.
Anyway, okay.
So why
do rabbits have periods?
Not that I know, but at any rate.
Oh.
So why do we have periods? And it isn't God's curse on women, believe me. And that's the way we might imagine it if we didn't know better. We really have periods to provide us with these two important hormones, estrogen and progesterone. And I'm going to be using some shorthand just for the slide's sake, E2 and P4, because, and color code everything so that, you know, you can follow along even if this is weird stuff for you. Because we need both of these hormones to allow us to become pregnant and carry a baby to full term, and to preserve healthy breasts, brain, bones. I think of these hormones as important for every cell in our bodies. And that's a different concept than most people have. But it's a concept that works in terms of helping us understand what's going on for ourselves. Now, I think of these two hormones as holding hands or being partners, or however you like to think about it. They work together every time, always. And we only get into difficulties when they're out of balance. Now, why is it so important to have both of these hormones? And don't get glassy-eyed here, but we need to talk a little bit about cells. Okay, so estrogen is an incredibly powerful growth stimulator. In terms of cells, it makes them proliferate. And probably from your biology, you remember that when cells proliferate, they're dividing. So they go through that whole process of doubling the DNA and then splitting it into two different cells, right? But what happens if growth isn't checked? What happens, Alice? Any idea?
You don't grow? Or you grow too
No.
much?
What happens if you have too much proliferation is there are accidents, mistakes in that genetic splitting,
Hmm.
and that usually leads to either disease or cancer. So it's extremely important that there is some kind of process to put a check on estrogen's growth. And that's what progesterone does. But in addition to that, it encourages cells to become more mature or differentiated to do the thing that cell is programmed to do. Okay?
That
So,
makes sense because my mum got breast cancer, which is sensitive to estrogen. So
right.
that that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And the good thing is that if you have a breast cancer, if it has receptors for progesterone as well as estrogen, then there's a better prognosis, a better outcome with
Hmm.
therapies. Okay, so we need both hormones for both growth and to control growth and for maturation. And we need both, as we were just talking about breasts, let's talk about a little experiment. I want to just give you a visual picture of what proliferation and control of proliferation mean. Okay, so there was an experiment with women who had a lump in their breast, and they were scheduled to have a surgery, small incision, and take out that lump just to be sure it wasn't cancer. So the investigators said, let's find out what the actions of estrogen and progesterone are on the breast tissue. So they had women randomized to put an estrogen gel on their breast that was going to have surgery, to put a progesterone gel or both together, or something that seemed the same as the hormones but didn't have any
Oh no,
active hormone. Okay,
the
so a
gel and frozen for someone
four-part
else.
randomized trial. Now, I want to show you, here's the breast cells from a woman who was putting estrogen on her breast. And they've stained it with a specific stain that turns sort of reddish if the cell is proliferating, growing. And you can see that there's a lot of these cells that are quite bright reddish pink. Do you see that? So it turned out there were 19.4% of all the cells that were proliferating in this woman on estrogen therapy. I mean, who'd rubbed this estrogen into her breast. Okay. Now, another woman had progesterone rubbed into her breast. Now it's the same stain, and only one out of all the cells we can see here was proliferating, a
Sorry, I'm back.
1.1%. Pardon?
I'm back. Sorry, I left for a brief period.
Okay, but here, as well as less proliferation, and by the way, these were women who started putting this on their breast when they were starting their period. So their estrogen levels were increasing. So this would be almost to the mid-cycle estrogen peak. And in spite of that, progesterone prevented proliferation. But you can also see now that this looks like it's got a hollow in the middle with no cells. That's the duct forming, which means progesterone is making these cells grow up. Okay.
Cool.
All right. Is that clear? So we've got two hormones that work together in every tissue, every cell in our bodies. How do they relate to the menstrual cycle? So what's normal for menstrual cycles? Starting with the anatomy, the menstrual cycles originate in ovaries, and we've got two. It's kind of fail-safe process. If you had to have one out, the other one would do just fine. It has enough. And the ovaries make two hormones that we've already talked about, estradiol and progesterone, and they are directly controlled, coordinated by two pituitary hormones, sort of behind the bridge of your nose.
Mm.
LH, which you've probably luteinizing hormone, which is often used as a test for ovulation, and follicle stimulating hormone, which stimulates the new follicles to grow. Okay, so put it all together and you get this. Now, this looks like a familiar diagram. It has days across the bottom, and this is a typical 28-day cycle. It also has an up and down line here for when an egg is supposed to be released on cycle day 14. You start counting from the first day of flow. So here's flow for this cycle, and you can see there's flow for the next cycle. Now let's look at the two hormones for a sec. Estrogen starts out low and rises to make a peak. It drops down a bit, rises again, then falls before the next flow. We're all familiar with that, I hope. Progesterone is quite different. It's low for the first half of the cycle, and then it rises to a peak. But you'll see, you know, estrogen's the big peak, progesterone's the small peak. That's what we usually see if we go to Google, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the 28-day cycle is sort of like the
We're all
moon
witches.
cycle. Here's half of the moon cycle. It's going, I'm not good with visuals, so I was going to switch it around from a full moon, waning moon, because the new moon, if in the northern hemisphere, is like a C. So your right hand C. And the waning moon is like a C with your left hand. So 28-day cycle is kind of like the moon cycle, but of course that's an average of cycle days. But what if that diagram I showed you and our ideas about the menstrual cycle are full of mythology? What I just showed is very typical. And if you look at it, it doesn't have, whoops, sorry.
Oh no.
Sorry, I get it. It doesn't have the units of measurement here, which it should have. There should be measures here, okay? So basically it reflects culture. The idea is estrogen is dominant, progesterone is, you only need it if you're gonna get pregnant. And that, or for menopausal women, you only need it if you're taking estrogen therapy and haven't had a hysterectomy, which is such a narrow view of the system that we just talked about. Here's what actually happens. Now, this is a funny kind of units of measure, but it's looking at the percent change of both estrogen and progesterone from their low levels here during flow. Estrogen rises about 240% from its baseline. Progesterone rises 1,400%. So you can get an idea of how much progesterone needs to be made to counterbalance the amount of estrogen.
Wow, I did not know
Yeah.
that. So,
Yeah,
estrogen is more potent as a hormone. It kind of has more of an impact in smaller doses. Is that
I
right?
guess it does, yes.
And
And
yeah,
the other thing, and this is kind of nerdy, but they're in different units. So estrogen is in picomoles per liter, and progesterone is in nanomoles, and the difference in unit size is 1,000.
yeah,
So the units progesterone is in is 1,000-fold bigger than the units estrogen is in. So when they don't show on a diagram like we just saw, when they don't show any units,
yeah,
right, then it can be drawn to match what we think rather than what really is, which is here. Is that clear?
that is clear. It's all about the key, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's about knowing what's accurate rather than about just taking somebody else's idea for it. And I have to say that really much of what have learned about women's reproduction, I've taught myself by asking questions and finding the original data, asking if it makes sense in terms of my experience and the experience that patients tell me about. So it's not beyond any of us to learn this. Okay, now here's the important part. And again, it's something that's often forgotten. And that is that above the pituitary that's making LH and FSH, we have the hypothalamus, And the hypothalamus interprets everything in our lives and is saying, is this okay? Is this small enough of a stressor or change or whatever, so that the woman could safely get pregnant and carry a healthy baby? And if the answer is no, it makes adjustments through hormonal signals, through LH and FSH, to modify how the menstrual cycle occurs. So if we're not sleeping, or we're over exercising, or we're not eating enough to match our energy demands, or if we're losing weight, or if we're raped or sexually abused, or even chronic um, prejudice,
Mhm.
stigma, being mistreated at work, not getting the promotion or recognition, or physical illness. All of those things are interpreted by the hypothalamus to control and to make sure that the reproduction is safe.
That's the point of it. It's kind of like the filter. It's like, is this woman good to have a
Yeah,
baby right now? No, she's just been sacked.
yeah,
Probably not a
that's
great
right.
time. Cool.
Yeah, she's arguing with her partner. This is not the right time, and
Amazing that our
and
bodies
rather
can do
uh,
that.
there's a built-in contraception, if you will.
Yeah. Who knew?
Yeah. So if you put the whole thing together, and again, this is complicated, but but if you understand the big purpose, then it kind of makes sense. So there's all kinds of feedback loops here throughout the whole system, and there's language, science kind of language, nerdy kind of language about system complex thinking. So things aren't directly related to others. They may have a curve to them. They may be plus one side one time and negative another time. All interpreted and complexly regulated by whether it's healthy or not.
Mm,
Okay,
cool.
now that's a lot of background, but now we can talk about cycles and what's normal. What's normal for cycle length is actually balanced on either side of that 28 days. And I was surprised actually when I first got some real data and found that the average was 28 days. But it can be 21 to 35 days long and be perfectly normal. And that translates to 3 to 5 weeks. Okay?
Cool.
Now, we'll talk about ovulation in a second, but the luteal phase length has a particular necessary duration because it seems to take progesterone at least 10 days to change the lining of the uterus to allow an egg to implant. And this 10 days is by quantitative basal temperature, and I'll give you the web link to how you can do that for yourself. So it's taking an old-fashioned thing. Many apps use it, but none of them use a quantitative validated method. And it's really pretty hard when you take a temperature record and it's going up
Mhm,
and it's going down and you don't know what's going on. Where do
mhm.
I say, did I ovulate or not? Is it a bit higher here or not? The temperature, quantitative basal temperature, allows that.
Is the luteal phase before, like, is that the fun bit when you're ovulating? Or is that the bit after you've ovulated?
That's right. It's the time
After.
from ovulation until the day before the next flow
Yeah.
starts.
The time I'm very sad. Someone's asked, when you've got, I think you might touch on PMDD later, but
Yes. Yeah.
is there a way to shorten the luteal phase?
Oh, there's lots of ways. That is the
Please make
most
it shorter,
that
please.
is no, you do not want it shorter. That is the most common adaptive change in the menstrual cycle, is shortening of the luteal phase.
It's such a horrendous
No,
time
we'll
for
come
me
back
and
to
everyone
it.
in my life.
We'll come back to it.
Okay, cool.
So
Make it better, please.
what is ovulation? And on the left, I apologize for the French, but it's the best diagram I could find. And the ovary is this blob here, and you can see the dominant follicle, follicle digraph here, but is basically a sphere that has liquid in the center of it. It's a cyst, okay? But it's also got the egg surrounded by its granulosa cells here. Now, if we go over here, this is the follicle cyst, and there's the egg popping out. This is
Wow.
literally from a laparoscopy as a woman ovulated. So it's quite I love the picture actually.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I kind of forget, you know, when everyone says release an egg, you kind of actually forget what's happening at that time.
Yeah.
Um, it is pretty amazing that that's popping out. How big is that egg, do you reckon?
Oh, very, very tiny,
Oh,
less than the head of a pin.
oh okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Um, Dr. Wikipedia says each month, one of the ovaries releases a mature egg. What do you think about that?
It's not mature.
It's not true.
Oh,
It's not true because often our periods are controlled by this, is it safe to ovulate kind of
yeah,
thing? And so
yeah,
sometimes we don't ovulate.
yeah,
Any rate.
yeah.
So we can look at the cycle length as kind of this long, narrow box. So here's flow and the follicular phase, the first part of the cycle after ovulation. Now we've got the blue again for progesterone, because that's when progesterone is high, and it has a normal length. In the short luteal phase, it's shorter than normal.
Mhm.
And you can have an identical seeming menstrual cycle that doesn't release an egg at all.
How does that work? Like your womb's still building up the lining, expecting an egg, but there's just no egg coming out, so it
That's right.
sheds in
We
28 days.
used to think that it was the egg that wasn't fertilized, so an egg with a sad face, right?
Mhm.
That brings down the flow with it. In
Yeah.
fact, that's an old idea,
Wow.
is that a non-fertilized egg brings down the lining of the uterus. But we now know that the, the periodicity of estrogen occurs whether or not an egg is released, and the shedding can be and often is identical.
Oh.
So you can't tell, nor can your partner tell, if you're making an egg this cycle or not.
You still bleed and you still maybe feel good when that estrogen's peaking and
Yeah, you
yeah.
may have
Mm,
all of the other stuff, but simply not ovulate. And so when a cycle is of normal length, like these two, but not normal ovulation, it's called silent or subclinical ovulatory disturbance. And
mm,
they are very common, but they're usually not detected. And and this has huge implications for the 32-year-old who's been on the pill for 20 years who wants to get pregnant,
mm,
because it takes a while for the system to develop normal ovulation. And if it's all been suppressed by the pill, that
mhm.
may or may not develop in time.
Are there any signs? I've got a question here from Emily. Are there any signs in your period flow or color to indicate that you're not actually ovulating? Is there any way you could tell?
Mm-mm. Now,
No.
this is hmm, a bit strange. You may be embarrassed about it, but I think there's a smell difference.
Mm.
And I think flow, when you haven't ovulated, smells a bit nasty, a bit fishy. But
Ah.
flow, when you have, smells just a bit salty or like a sea breeze or something. I, I think so.
That's crazy. How did you figure this out, Sherilyn?
Oh, I don't know. I remembered going down, like taking my place in a row of students in high school and smelling that fishy smell. And then I remembered smelling it later and figuring out that I hadn't ovulated. I
Mhm.
actually started tracking my own cycles and ovulation in before 1980. And so I had a really long record of my own cycles. And by now I've done lots of studies with other women, so I have lots of other women's data as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Is there any papers on that or any published research? That's really interesting.
Not on smell. We did ask the question, can you tell by the way you feel that your period is coming? Went
Yeah.
to a large group of women and found that that really there were no differences between those who ovulated in that cycle and those who didn't. And the only thing that we found that was anywhere close to something that would say that you'd ovulated was if you got tenderness, I'll get up a little bit here, on the high side of your breast, but no tenderness in the front.
Oh.
That was called, that would be, was specific for an ovulatory cycle.
Wow. There's so much we could go into there, but
do you know what front of the breast tenderness means?
high estrogen?
Yes.
Yes.
And the only time, the only time in the cycle that is normal is at the mid-cycle peak.
Yeah.
And so a bit of a sidebar, but when I was in perimenopause, I had sore breasts. Oh, so sore breasts for 10 years, I swear.
Yeah.
And it was that more than anything that made me say, look, my estrogen levels are not low, they're not deficient, they're bloody high.
Mine always get a bit different around ovulation. So yeah, that's why I guess that. Anyone got any other questions on ovulation? I've got one here just before we move on. Is there a reason why some people experience painful ovulation and some don't feel it at all?
Yeah, good question. So if you see here's a blood vessel in this picture, if there's a blood vessel that gets ruptured when that egg is released, then there's some blood that goes into the lining of the abdominal cavity, the peritoneum, and that causes irritation, which is the pain that you feel.
Cool.
That's in the German word for that is Mittelschmerz.
Is that why sometimes you might bleed a tiny little bit when you ovulate because the blood vessels burst?
Usually it doesn't come out.
Okay.
Usually it isn't captured. It has to be more than that. It's the bleeding that happens at mid-cycle usually means there's too much estrogen and not enough progesterone.
Okay. Good to know.
So let's go on. Here's the slide where I've put the links to keeping a menstrual cycle diary. I didn't show it, but this diary is different than all the PMS and all those other tools because it has positive things and ordinary things as well as negative mood stuff. And it has things like feeling of energy and feeling of self-worth and interest in sex and common things like problems with sleep or constipation. You can record cramps and flow. And then here's the quantitative basal temperature link.
Cool. We'll send these around to everyone after the
Good.
session.
Good. They're free. I think it's really important that women be able to figure out this stuff for themselves. Definitely. So what happens when cycles are far apart or irregular? Well, using our old bar diagram again, here's a cycle that's too long, longer than 40 days, although this kind of a cycle may be normal in the first couple years, well, is normal in the first couple years after your first period. And this longer cycle, called oligomenorrhea, actually had ovulation. So don't assume just because a cycle is long that you can't get pregnant or ovulate in it. And then I've shown on the bottom here, not having a period. This is like what happened to me when I went away to university, I didn't have a period for 9 months. And I went home and worked in Alaska, uh, and, and was with my family again and got my period back, and it never went away again. So, and I was telling Alice before we started that that's kind of in the back of my mind is why I ended up, when I was becoming an endocrinologist, being an unusual one, and one who focuses on women's reproductive hormones rather than on thyroid or diabetes or
Mhm.
etc. So here's just repeating what we already said. Oligomenorrhea is simply the name for far apart cycles that are 36 to 90 days, and they can be ovulatory or anovulatory. They're more likely to be not ovulatory. And amenorrhea means absent cycles or no flow. Actually, nowadays we say no flow for 90 days or 3 months is also
Mhm.
part of amenorrhea.
Can we
Eh,
ask a
eh,
few questions on kind of disturbances?
Sure.
So, um, it- loads of questions really about like how contraception impacts your cycle in regular periods. Is it normal for your periods to fluctuate when you first start something? You know, since having my implant out, my cycle has gone down to 21 days. My period lasts 8 days. It's basically 1 week on, 1 week off. Oh, I've been there. You know, these types of things. I'm assuming contraception disturbs, and it's not a normal cycle, but any comments on I guess what hormonal contraception does to your cycle and
Yes.
when you come off it, how it works?
So basically, the contraceptive, the combined hormonal contraceptive, the pill, or the same kind of doses in the patch or the ring, they're all the same in terms
Mhm.
of what hormones, has at least 4 times higher amount of estrogen than in the normal menstrual cycle. It's like a sledgehammer, and it has to be, or it wouldn't stop ovulation. It wouldn't take over at the hypothalamic level from our own cycles. And it has about, obviously every day, but about the amount of progesterone that would be present in a normal cycle, except that both of the hormones are synthetic. They're knockoffs.
Yeah,
It's
fakes.
like thinking you're getting the real deal when you're getting, something that's fake. And many of the progestins are have male hormone like characteristics. They're built from a testosterone molecule rather than from progesterone. Um, Whenever there's a disruption of the cycle for pregnancy, because or after amenorrhea, or after oligomenorrhea, or after being on the pill, or having an implant, or Depo-Provera, there are months of adjustment. In fact, stopping the pill, it takes 6 to 9 months before the cycle and ovulation return. Some
Mhm.
beautiful studies that were done in Germany looking at that. It takes about 3 months after getting an IUD out, for example, before
Yeah.
you could get pregnant.
Yeah, and we
Eh,
actually collect data on that as well, and it's really interesting
mm,
looking at the differences in kind of return to normal. But I guess what we're learning today is that even if you are bleeding, you might not actually be ovulating. So there
that's
might
right.
still be breakthrough bleeds for maybe a couple
Hmm.
of months afterwards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And usually, for sure, that 21 days with 8 days of flow is very, very likely to be non ovulatory and to
Mm,
have high estrogen levels. And it's the body's trying to get things back on track again, but it's complicated to ovulate, and
yeah.
needs some, it needs some time to get it sorted.
Cool. Thank you.
Shall we go on now?
Yeah. Let's go
Okay.
on.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about premenstrual syndrome. Melimina, by the way, is the term it's a term from the Greek, and we used to use it in medicine. It's called the work of bringing down the flow. And it means things that you might, I mean, I really believe that both hormones have effects on the brain. And if we're tuned into it, we can perceive changes, right? That's why I did that study, to see if we could figure out about ovulation or not. So clearly they have effects on the brain. But when we get to the point of calling it a disease or a syndrome or something that disadvantages us, that means that likely things are not normal. Okay?
Mhm.
The normal ovulatory menstrual cycle is something that has very few negative and certainly no major negative symptoms. So let's talk about this a second. I differ here from many people, just so you know, in believing, and with some good evidence, that when you have PMS, it's because your estrogen level is way too high for the amount of progesterone.
Mm.
You're likely not ovulatory or ovulatory with too little progesterone, and you likely have way too much estrogen.
Most people believe it's because you've got too much progesterone, right?
I know. And the evidence that progesterone causes depression or progesterone causes negative mood is really almost non-existent. I mean, I had PMS symptoms myself, and the time I had them, looking back on it, now I can see more clearly, was when I was for sure ovulating, but I was going through a lot of stress. I was in the, shortly after I separated from my partner of 13 years. And I had a little baby, and, it was a really tough time. So what I think we do is to blame on the menstrual cycle all of the stressors that we're experiencing. So we may have some money worries, we may have some conflicts with children or siblings or parents, we may have some partner issues, we may have things happening at work, and usually we can cope. And then in the last half of the cycle, we can't cope,
Mm.
but we tend to blame everything on the hormones rather than saying, well, maybe I need to talk with my boss and tell him or her how it feels that I didn't get promoted, or how it feels that this person at work is making negative comments or downplaying my work or whatever. And so that's one important idea. The other is to say to people around you, I'm feeling irritable, sad, whatever, and I'm trying to figure out why, but don't take it personally.
Mm.
Okay. But just owning the feeling is important. I feel,
Yeah.
because if you say, I feel, when, let's say, somebody makes a really snotty comment, if you say, I feel, put down when you say that, that nobody can argue with how you feel. That's how you feel.
What's the evidence around what hormones cause that? For example, the estrogen causes you to feel sad, and do some women just have more estrogen than others? Is that why, for example, I get really bad PMS? Is there any evidence around that?
There is evidence. How how estrogen is excreted varies according to a genetic makeup. And I think, for example, that I metabolize and get rid of estrogen more slowly. And families that have this, my mother had a breast cancer and a colon cancer, and both of those are related to higher estrogen. Both of those are hormonally linked cancers. What's interesting is that East Asian people, No, I'm not talking, and I know in Britain you tend to think of Asian as including those people from India. But I'm talking Chinese, Korean, Japanese people actually metabolize sex hormones more quickly. And I think consequent to that have less premenstrual symptoms, less hot flushes, etc. Um, so,
Fascinating.
what's unfortunate is that we don't yet have sufficiently easy ways to document ovulation, so we can't really come to a population-based idea about people who have, severe PMS, having different hormone levels.
Mm.
All of it is anecdotal. And although there was a study in Canada that randomly picked a day of a cycle and interviewed women, not telling them they were interested in PMS, and then asked the women to send in a postcard when their next period started. And only 1% of the population, it was large, like 3,000 women, only 1% had severe premenstrual symptoms. So there's a tendency to blame hormones. That is a societal tendency.
Mm.
And hormones, which is why I made a point of telling you about the way in which our body adjusts hormones based on what's happening in our lives. Hormones are always only part of the picture.
And the synthetic ones that are in hormonal contraceptives aren't real. So they're like lookalikes. And that's why some
Yeah,
people don't react very well to them because I don't know, I'm making this up, but is the body like, that's
sure.
not that's not quite real. That's not what I kind of take as normal progesterone.
Or it's too much.
Yeah.
That or
Too-
I mean, I went to the Planned Parenthood when I was in medical school in Oregon, and I was going to get married in August. So I went to Planned Parenthood a month or so before and said I'm getting married, and they gave me the pill sample of the month, and I started taking it, and I lasted only 5 days. I just blew up. It was summertime, but I blew up like a balloon. I it changed my personality. I was a teetotaler, and I went out with a bunch of the women in where I was staying, and I had 5 beers in one night. And I mean, um, the, but the swelling was so bad that I couldn't get my sandals on even. And
Mm.
so I begged one of my intern friends to give me a water pill, and he did. And I broke it in half, being cautious, weighed myself, and took half of it. When I finally finished peeing, I was 9 pounds lighter. So, I mean, these hormones in high doses I mean, that the usual pill today is 20 micrograms of ethinyl estradiol. That pill that I took was 100 micrograms of ethinyl estradiol,
Yeah.
and it was only estrogen. Was the quirkiest pill. They only had estrogen in the first 10 days or something. So I tucked that away in my head and said, maybe estrogen isn't always so good, right?
They used to
And
be so much stronger, didn't they? They used to think that they needed to blast us. So,
And sometimes they still do.
yeah, true.
Any of the doses, I mean, the transgender women are now being treated with obnoxiously high doses now.
Yeah, yeah.
It's, yeah.
Can we do any blood tests or anything to find out whether, if you got 100,000 women and you blood tested them every day in their cycle?
No, no.
No?
Part of the reason is that the hormones are doing this all the
Mm.
time. They're pulsing because they come from the brain. They have a pulsatility like the nerve cells do, and they have bursts of production. And so a single hormone test isn't going to answer your question in most cases. That's why I mean, and I didn't have the money to do hormone tests in the old days, which is why I developed the diary and the quantitative basal temperature. But I still believe that they're a better way to learn about your cycle than any blood test.
Okay.
Shall we go on?
Yes. Sorry, we got stuck on PMS.
What if there's changes in the flow or heavy or light flow? But let's talk about flooding for a second. And again, it's usually this imbalance. When there's an imbalance in estrogen and progesterone, it's because estrogen's too high for the amount of progesterone. And for that reason, almost always the right answer, the helpful answer, is to take the natural progesterone, we now have it as oral micronized progesterone, as a pill for 14 days at the end of the cycle. It solves the problem for premenopausal heavy flow and flooding. It solves the problem for irregular cycles after pregnancy or after stopping depot. It really is a helpful therapy. And I am very sure that you would find it helped with PMS, especially since it has, quote, a side effect, and a side effect of improving sleep. Because taken orally, it helps deep sleep. Taken as a cream or through the skin, it doesn't.
Is this the combined pill we're talking about, or just
No,
one?
no, I'm talking about natural progesterone,
Oh, okay.
oral micronized progesterone.
Can you take it like as a drug, or is it?
Yeah,
Wow, I didn't know that.
it's a formulary medicine in most countries. I think it's now available in Britain.
Mm,
It should be. Yeah, it is available in Britain. Oral micronized progesterone.
I'm writing that down. Because we've had loads of questions about heavy flow and, what are the alternatives apart from
Okay.
going on
The other thing
contraception?
that this is something every woman should know. Um, if you scratch, you get a scratch or a mosquito bite and it turns red and there's pain or itching or something, that's usually caused by prostaglandins. Well, there's two different prostaglandins that are related to flow in the lining of the uterus. And ibuprofen, the over-the-counter pill that you can buy for headache or stuff, or for cramps, it's effective for cramps, if taken in not in even big doses, decreases the flow by 20 to 50%. So one ibuprofen pill taken with each of 3 meals on a heavy flow day can significantly decrease the amount of flow, which means that before you go to the doctor and before you become anemic, you can do something about heavy flow yourself. And again, there's an article about heavy flow on the SEMCOR website. You'll find it.
I never knew that. That's fascinating.
Yeah, it's
Um,
important. And it works with progesterone because they work different ways.
mhm. um, Random question, but why do our cycles sometimes the bleeding is heavier and lighter? Like you have a really heavy month and then a lighter month. And is there any evidence around what causes that?
Lighter almost always means lower estrogen. And it's not clear whether lower progesterone it plays a role in that picture or not. The other thing that's a clue to the amount of estrogen is the shorter the cycle, the higher the estrogen. The
Mm,
longer the cycle, the lower the estrogen, even within the normal range,
okay,
which is helpful.
that is helpful.
Yeah. And another thing that you can pay attention to is, at the middle of the month, the cervix has glands that respond to estrogen and make a clear, stretchy mucus. You can stretch it out if you take a look at it. And that stretchy character is actually makes a sperm highway. So it makes it more likely you can get pregnant at that point in time. But that's a good sign of the mid-cycle estrogen peak. But
Yeah.
if that stretchy mucus stays stretchy longer than about, this much, for more than 3 days, it's a high, really high estrogen peak. So another way of assessing your own hormone levels.
Wow. So you might know you've got a really heavier, no, wait. Yeah, heavier period coming up.
Yeah, that's right.
Hmm,
And
that's
my sister, who's not medical at all, taught me, she said, if I get sore breasts in the middle of a month, it's going to be a bitch of a PMS.
These are coming.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow. That is so interesting. Why do we
Yeah,
not know this type of information? It's so cool. Oh my God.
it's
Wow.
making science help us understand ourselves.
Yeah.
And I really think as we understand ourselves better, we can begin to better achieve the equality we're seeking.
Mhm. Yeah. Hannah says, this is fascinating. Thank you. I'm with you. Anything else you can fascinate us with, Geraldine?
I think do we have more questions in the questions screen?
Yeah, I mean, so many. Let's go back to that progesterone that you recommended. Is that a prescription drug?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
It,
And you
it
take it
must,
in the second half of the cycle, did you
yeah.
say? Okay.
It needs to be taken at bedtime because it does increase sleepiness, and you don't want to take it and try to drive or do something, fine motor stuff. Um, and it needs to be taken for a full 14 days. And if you go on the Semcor website, here we are again, here's the link to it,
Yeah.
you'll see cyclic progesterone therapy. And there's a one-pager handout that you print out as a PDF and take to your family doctor, for example.
Awesome. Um, are there external factors that affect how much estrogen and progesterone we make naturally?
Yes, if you're gaining weight, if you're eating a high-fat diet, you're
Mm.
likely to increase the amount of estrogen you make.
So
And
it's
the
mm,
more fruits and vegetables, the more likely you are to have a normally ovulatory cycle. There's Unfortunately, there are things, and we don't really know about diet, but it's the whole diet together we have to think about, not this, mineral or that. I think it's likely that not having enough vitamin D is associated with high estrogen. And so taking more vitamin D might help with high estrogen problems.
and just going back to heavy periods, do you ever grow out of them? Do
Oh,
your
yeah.
yeah. Okay, so your hormones can
Hmm.
change,
Hmm.
that signal can start
Yep.
changing.
The other thing to realize, though, is that it's very common. A third of perimenopausal women, when their cycles are still regular or they're just getting irregular, have heavy flow. And often at that point in time, people will think, oh, you've got fibroids. But that's rarely ever fibroids. It's that imbalance with too much estrogen.
Mhm. I always thought estrogen was the good one. Never knew.
Well,
Never thought
they're
about that
both
way.
good.
Oh,
That's
sorry, Jalen.
that's the point. They're both good. They're both important, but they need balance.
They do.
Yeah. And
Um,
that estrogen, well, there's a sort of a saying. It was actually written by a doctor in a newspaper article years ago, saying estrogen's what makes a girl a girl. And that's just
yeah.
wrong, because we're a girl because we feel like a woman. And there's many of us who live in women's bodies who don't feel like women, or whatever. There's a whole variety of differences between gender and sex.
Yeah.
But I would say if estrogen's what makes a girl, then progesterone's what makes a girl a healthy woman.
What's your opinion from Lucinda on use of hormonal contraceptives to control things, you know, around your periods, your cycle?
I think it's never smart.
Mm,
It's like, you know, treating a pimple with a sledgehammer.
yeah.
It really, it has profound effects on the whole body. And yes, we need effective contraception. I mean, I was in a pickle when I couldn't take the pill, and I tried an IUD and they couldn't get it in those days. But I successfully used barrier method plus a full applicator of vaginal spermicide for the entire rest of my married life without ever having a miss.
Mm.
So we can control our own fertility by ways that are under our control without having to put these chemicals into our bodies.
What contraceptives do you recommend or think are quite good for us
Well,
or have
the
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 least
copper
impact?
IUD is useful because it doesn't alter your hormones, but it effectively prevents pregnancy. I would recommend that. It does tend to make heavier cycles and sometimes more cramps, but you should be able to control that easily by using ibuprofen.
Yeah. And they calm
Again,
down a bit.
there's stuff on the website about cramps, period pain, and again, we're told to take a ibuprofen every 6 hours or something, but by then usually the cramps have come back.
Mm.
And so if you take it to stay ahead of the cramps, it works like a hot damn. It's amazing.
What do you think about things like natural cycles and apps that help women? Um,
I think most of them are, well, I think they're helpful because they help you pay attention. And we need to live in our bodies. We need to get to know them, but most of them are not sufficient. They're not telling us accurate stuff about ovulation.
they're kind of a ovulation light program. Is that what you're saying?
Well, they may tell us we ovulated when we didn't, which I don't think is okay.
Mm.
Um, and these are, you know how it is that Google shifts what ads you see by what interests you have. Well, many of these apps change based on what you had previously rather than telling you actually what you now have. I mean, that's not okay. We need to
Yeah.
know what's happening this cycle, not what some computer thinks should be happening this cycle.
Yeah, and they're probably they're more likely to tell you you're ovulating when you're not because they're so petrified of you having sex when you're ovulating that they'll just
That's
always
right.
say you're
Yep.
ovulating. They're like, yeah,
Hmm.
you're definitely going to be ovulating. Use a condom for 10 days instead of actually, maybe, you know, that's not
Hmm.
happening. Yeah.
Yep.
Um, I've tried to
Shall
get
we
through.
shall we
Yeah.
summarize? Because we're
Yeah,
getting
let's
a little
summarize.
long now.
There's so much.
Okay. So we've covered that the normal period is 3 to 5 weeks long with 2 to 5 days of flow and usually is pretty predictable within a woman. And its purpose is to provide balanced estrogen and progesterone. That ovulation and progesterone levels are variable even within regular cycles, and it's a way our body protects us and our community when we shouldn't be getting pregnant. Heavy flow means higher estrogen, less progesterone. The same is true for PMS. And by the way, I forgot to tell you before that PMS is helped by regular exercise, good sleep, healthy eating, and having somebody to talk to about what's, just being able to say, like, I'm feeling sad today, or I'm feeling irritable today. And
Mm.
somebody who'll listen without trying to tell you what to do, right? Okay.
I mean, I've been reading you know, in teen magazines since the age of 12, like, get off the sofa, go for a run, don't worry, everything's going to be fine. But
Yeah.
at the age of 32, I'm still finding PMS horrible. Even if it's a cultural construct, I still feel that feeling and I
Yeah, no,
feel
no, I
low.
know. But try increasing
Yeah.
the amount of exercise you do. Try decreasing the amount of simple sugars.
Mm,
Have a vegetable instead of something sweet. Just try it. And that's what's useful about that diary is you can print out a diary with extra lines and say, here's my exercise, here's how many minutes of exercise I did today,
mm.
right?
I'd love to
And
do like a PMS clinic, or, you know, actually deep dive more into PMS, because I'm fascinated by it and what we know and what we don't know about it. So maybe we could do a follow-up all
I'll
about
send you,
PMS.
sure, sure. And we can do a follow about hormonal contraception if you want,
Sounds
or
great.
how to treat abnormal cycles.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Thanks
So
everyone for listening. Geraldine, do you want to close with some final thoughts?
sure,
I'm guessing it's about two
it
hormones.
takes two hormones, and progesterone is just as important as estrogen. And there's a link to a blog about a recent paper I wrote that's worth taking a look at.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Geraldine. I've really enjoyed it and it's been so interesting. I hope everyone's found it as fascinating as I have. Yeah, key takeouts for me is it's your hypothalamus controls everything. There's something to do with the way your period might smell. Loads of interesting stuff about PMS and how it might be caused by estrogen and not progesterone, which is what I always thought. And yeah, thanks everyone. If you've got any feedback for us about the event, or if there's anything you want to find out more about, yeah, we've got comments about menopause and PMS. So yeah, please drop me an email with any feedback, and I can pass it on to Geraldine as well.
And also, I ask a number of questions, and the answer to the questions are in a quiz that she can post later.
Amazing. What animal has periods, finally? Is it the rabbit? No.
Old world apes and humans. That's it.
Is that it? Okay.
Yep.
Interesting.
Except for the spiny mouse. There's a peculiar mouse that gets periods.
Oh wow, that is really weird. Well, that poor spiny mouse out there. There's probably millions out there who are experiencing PMS right
Having
now.
PMS. Poor PMS-y spiny mouse.
Thanks everyone. I will share the video in an email if you want to, watch again. And yeah, thanks for joining us. Really